What's up, my fellow seekers? So today I'm actually on vacation, but I figured I would do a YouTube video anyway for I'm bored, and also because I thought it'd be benefit to y'all, and it's been like a little over a week, so I figured I'd go ahead and post one. Today's going to be a discussion on Genesis 1:1, or just Genesis 1. So let's dig in. An overall debate surrounds whether Genesis 1 is prose or poetry. And Gordon Wenham concludes, after investigating, that it is both. And it's called elevated prose. And that means it is, quote, a careful literary composition introducing the succeeding narrative. That's on page 10 of his Gordon Wenham's commentary. Like I said, this basically means it's a mixture of both, which makes sense because there's both in there, and we'll get into that in a little bit. A certain characteristic that describes Genesis 1 as a whole would be, quote, the pattern of a movement from generalization to particularization. And that is Gordon Wenham on page 117. You can also compare that with Wenham's commentary, pages 6 to 7. And to explain this, let me point this out. Day 1 has the creation of light. Day 4 has the creation of the luminaries, the sun, the moon, the stars. Day 2 has the creation of the seas and the skies. Day 5 has creation of the birds and the fish. And then day 3 has the creation of land and vegetation. And then day 6 has the creation of land animals and people, the things that dwell on land. So you can see how this all kind of fits together. And this is kind of what convinced me the most that Genesis 1 is more literary than it is literal, because that just looks like a compositional device. It looks like some kind of literary device that would contain truthful elements in it, like God created everything, but it's not exactly how it went down. Now, something very important to get from Genesis is that the very foundation of science is provided by Genesis. Gordon Wenham explains, quote, its, i.e. scientific enterprise, assumption of unity and order rests on underlining the manifold and seemingly capricious phenomena of experience rests on Genesis 1's assertion of the one almighty God who created and controls the world according to a coherent plan. Only such an assumption can justify the scientific method. Were this world controlled by a multitude of capricious deities or subject to mere chance, no consistency could be expected in experimental results, and no scientific laws could be discovered. That's on page 39 of Wenham's commentary. So, in fact, this is the reason why Christians invented modern science. A lot of people don't know that. Like, for example, Newton, the one who discovered gravity and stuff, he was a theologian more than he was a scientist. He wrote books on theology, and you can go read them. But not only did they believe that they were discovering things because God laid out a rational world, but they did it because they believed that what they were doing were glorifying God. And so, yeah, that's something to note there. Now, let's go into Genesis 1:1. Now, we automatically get in a debate on the first word, Hebrew, at least in Hebrew, Bereshith. In English, it's 3 words, in the beginning. Now, should it be translated in the beginning, God created? For example, the ones who translate that would be ESV, NASB, NET, NIV, CSB, Victor Hamilton, and Gordon Wenham. They all do it. Or should it be translated when God began to create, when God created, or in the beginning of? One example would be NRSV, who holds that. Not many translations do it that way, but some do. Those who hold to the latter view usually take Genesis 1:1 as a dependent clause, verse 2 as a parenthetical clause, and verse 3 as a continuation of verse 1. So a very long sentence, which is important. We'll get to that in a second. Now, one point, there's actually 4 ways that this can be taken, but this one, the 2 I've laid out, the in the beginning and when God created, are the 2 most well known, or commonly held. There we go. Now, one point used for the dependent clause argument, which is what I'm just calling the second one, is that the Hebrew lacks the definite article, so literally it's in beginning. Now, here's the problem. Quote, omission of the definite article is regular in temporal phrases and does not necessarily indicate that Reshith, which is the word, Bereshith has be, which is inseparable preposition, but Reshith is the actual word, so does not necessarily indicate that Reshith should be taken as a construct, which is what, when God created, in the beginning of, that's a construct. A second point that they make is that Reshith occurs around 50 times in the Hebrew Bible, but all but possibly one of those times, Isaiah 46:10, are based in the construct state, or in the construct state. However, it's clear from the exception of Isaiah 46:10 that while it could be, that it would seem to be that it was most likely in the construct state, it doesn't have to be. And I think that's an important point. And so we need to look at the evidence to see if it is or not. We can't just rely on that because there is an exception, so it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, the other 4 occurrences of Bereshith, all in Jeremiah, is followed by a verb, a finite verb. And in Genesis 1:1, it's followed by a noun. So it is possible, maybe even probable, that the difference in nuance is due to the type of words being used after the fact. Yet another piece of evidence is that Genesis 1:1-3 is supposed to follow the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation account. However, there's 2 problems with this. One, it just assumes Genesis is based off that account, not similar traditions being passed down. So, in my view, what happened was Adam was created, so we got this focal point. And after Adam was created, they would have dispersed, and then demons got involved, human nature got involved, and they would start worshiping other gods, and then legend would have creeped in, and then you get like the Enuma Elish, which is not even close to Genesis, just for the record. But let's say that it was. Or let's just say that even if it's not, it's still a creation account that was passed down over time, and then Genesis just got the most reliable and most true account. That was a most true account, yeah. And I'm not willing to accept that it was based off the Enuma Elish without further evidence. But there's also a second problem. Even if Genesis is trying to depend on these pagan accounts, Victor Hamilton explains that, quote, "It is more accurate to say that there is a syntactical similarity between Enuma Elish 1-9 and Genesis 2:4 and what follows, but not between Enuma Elish 1-9 and Genesis 1:1-3. Obviously, Genesis 1:1 is unique." End quote. You can find that on Hamilton 107. Yeah. As for evidence that it should be translated in the beginning, God created, the most convincing argument is that pretty much every ancient, actually not pretty much, every ancient translation of it is in the beginning. So you look at the Greek, which says, NRK epoiesin ha theos ton uranon kai tain gain. The Vulgate translates it similarly. You can look at that on Victor Hamilton 107. Also, my sources are in the description below, so just go check them out if you want to check. Second, early Christians interpreted it this way. So it's not just the Jews, like the ones who translated the Septuagint, but even Christians have always translated that way. For example, Basil the Great in his exegetic homilies 1.5 says, "Thus the writer who wisely tells us of the birth of the universe does not fail to put these words at the head of the narrative. In the beginning, God created." That is to say, in the beginning of time. You can find that on Thomas Oden's Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture, Volume 1, page 2-3. Or, sorry, page 3. Let's see. This is one of many examples. Others include Augustine, Chrysostom, and many others. Interestingly, though, Origen doesn't take it that way, but he's in the minority view. Third piece of evidence that can be given is on stylistic grounds. The traditional translation in the beginning conforms to the pattern of sentence lengths throughout the chapter. So if you go and look, and I did a paper on this in my class, I demonstrated this, that if you look at it, Genesis is full of just short sentences. Most of them won't even take up a whole line on a page, and in Times New Roman 12 font. But if you were to take Genesis, or if you are to take Genesis 1:1 as in the beginning, then it would correspond to short sentences. If you take it as not that, and you can take the first 3 verses as a sentence, it's a very long sentence, which is just out of character for Genesis 1, and therefore not more likely. Now, the next question is Genesis 1:1 a title or summary for what follows? Hamilton takes that Genesis 1:1 as, quote, an opening statement functioning as a superscription and as a summary. You can find that on page 117. The MacArthur Study Bible takes this as a summary for the rest of the passage. The ESV Study Bible says it can be taken this way, but it would line up more with the New Testament to say that it should be read as, quote, the first event, the origin of the heavens and the earth sometime before the first day. That's page 49 in that study Bible. Now, according to Wenham, that's the traditional view, that it is the first event. I would side for this for two reasons. First, even though Wenham says it can be taken either way grammatically, to me it seems to suggest it's the first event. It says in the beginning. In the beginning of what? Of the universe. As will be explained, heavens and earth is a merism that is saying heavens and earth, meaning the universe. Therefore, it must be the beginning of time and the universe. That just kind of makes sense. So, therefore, it makes more sense to say verse 1 is the act of creation. The second reason is this traditional view, and I would side with those closer to the event than today. That's usually what I do. I don't hold a lot of stock in modern thinking. I mean, I do some, but most of the time I'm going to side with the ancients because they were closer in time and they weren't dumb. You know, a lot of people think they were stupid, but they weren't. Nonetheless, what others have pointed out is also very interesting, which is that it corresponds to the three fundamental aspects of reality. In the beginning, time, God created the heavens, space, and the earth, matter. So you got all three aspects of reality, time, space, and matter. I just thought that was interesting. I wanted to add that. Furthermore, as Wenham says, if the traditional view is correct, then this is a rejection of the common notion that matter pre-existed the God's work of creation. You can find that on page 37. Ancient Near East religion said God made the gods, plural. It's important because that's one of the differences between them, between Genesis and these other creation accounts. Says that the other gods made everything from pre-existing matter. However, Genesis puts them to shame by saying God created out of nothing. And that just shows God's power. And he could be doing, and I want to add that, he could be putting them to shame intentionally, though truthfully, by saying this. So he's trying to show how great God is. This also goes against the idea that the term create meant putting disorder into order. And you can even get that in the... Moses could have said, God created all living creatures swarming which swarm the waters. However, he specifically mentioned the sea monsters, or Tehom. Why? Either to show his power or to tell the pagan nations that they do not contend with God, as they believed, but that he created them, the sea monsters, and they demonstrate his power and skill. Now, saying that, let's go on to verse 3, saying that it was good means that God is pleased and approves of what he created. That's from Augustine. Verse 5. Now we must undertake the challenge of understanding the word yom, translated day. Both Wenham and Hamilton agree that it means a 24-hour period of time. There we go. I'm inclined to agree. See, the problem with saying it's not is that every time yom is used with a number in the entire Old Testament, it always means 24-hour period of time. There's not an exception. There's other reasons I think they mention. I don't remember if they do or not, but nonetheless, Hamilton takes it as an analogy that is used so that the original audience can understand. So it's more of a literary thing. The evidence he provides for this is the one I provided, which is that Genesis day 1 and day 4 correlate, day 2 and day 5 correlate, and day 3 and day 6 correlate. He provides the same evidence. As for Wenham, he gives evidence that several devices are used. Quote, the use of repeating formulae, the tendency to group words and phrases into tens and sevens, literary techniques such as chiasm and inclusio, and the arrangement of creative acts into matching groups and so on. Unquote. That is on page 39. Now, if he uses so many literary devices in Genesis 1, then why can't we just conclude the ordering or even the days are also literary devices? The second evidence he gives that evening and morning are described before the sun and moon even appear. However, this can easily be explained as God rotating the earth himself. However, and him being a light or providing a different light, I think a better point to bring up is the fact that God is creating according to day and night when he's creating the entire world. So we know that the earth rotates, and so part of it's always light. I'm trying to get in the camera. Part of it's always light, and part of it's always night. Oh, that rhymed. Dark, I guess. Light and dark. So why are you resting whenever this part's light and this one's dark? Why not just keep creating when it's always light? At some point, it's always light on one part of the world, but nonetheless. Lastly, he says At best, all language about God is analogical. That's not a very, very good point to me, because we're not talking about God's nature, we're talking about what he's done. And so, for example, Jesus rose from the dead. That's not analogical or allegorical or whatever. That's literal. That's what he did. There is no allegory there. And so I don't think that's a good point. Now, early Christians took this as literal, Ephraim the Syrian, for example, but others took it as allegorical. For example, Augustine. So that's not very helpful. Nonetheless, they did not take it the way that we take it today, as it being millions or billions. They took each day as 1,000 years, typically, according to 1 Peter 3:8, 2 Peter 3:8. Each day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, 1,000 years like one day. So it's not exactly what we would say, but they did take it allegorically as well. My opinion is that Yom is being used in a literary way. Is the earth young or old? I don't know. There's good evidence on both sides, to be completely honest with you. There are vital philosophical and theological questions that need to be addressed and answered, like why God would create man to rule the earth after most of the animals have already gone extinct. That doesn't really make sense. But we must deal with the scientific evidence, some scientific evidence being stronger than others. But let's move on. Genesis 1:6, the MacArthur Study Bible says that the expanse created on day 2 is the atmospheric and stellar heavens. That quote comes from page 4. This is interesting because it would suggest that the earth was created and then the stellar heavens and the atmosphere. I don't think that's what happened. That wouldn't really make sense. That wouldn't correlate with science either. So it also says, and literally, in the literature itself, it says that it was serving to separate the waters from the waters. Well, there's no water in the atmosphere, or in the stellar heavens, only in the atmosphere. So I think he's talking about the atmosphere and the oceans is what he's talking about. Genesis 1:9-10. Something interesting is that God does not say in verses 9-10 that God had the water go into one place, or that he does say that God wanted water to go into one place and dry land appear. Coupled with Genesis 10:25, which says, quote, to Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his day the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Yeah, that's the ESV version. It's also mentioned in Genesis 11 after Babel. A possible young earth perspective is that God made the land as one continent, Pangaea, and then separated it after Babel. This is by no means necessary, and other interpretations have been put forth, but it is a possibility we have to address. The Cultural Background Study Bible actually says that's what it's referring to as well. You can see that on page 5 of the Cultural Background Study Bible by Keener and Walton. Genesis 1:11-12. What are the kinds of animals and plants or whatever that are being created? Well, may say the kinds is mostly referring to the family taxonomical classification. I'm inclined to agree. Except sometimes I would say there's some nuance. Some it might be genus, some it might be order? Yeah, order, and some might even be phyla. I don't know. Phylum. Now let's go on to Genesis 1:14-18. The creation of the luminaries is important. This is a translational thing. Some say lights. I say luminaries. I think that's a better translation. But the reason is because ancient civilizations used to worship certain star clusters, the sun, and the moon. However, the author of Genesis is saying that they were created by the ultimate God and not eternal. Therefore, they are not deserving of worship. This was like revolutionary in the ancient world where everybody did it. Whether or not it was meant to be a polemic against the pagans or just a separate account of creation that has no connection to pagan accounts, that can be debated. I claim to the idea that is in a sense both of the two things I just mentioned. I think it'd be wise to say that Moses wanted to show people that the heavenly bodies didn't deserve worship and did so by explaining the truth that they were created and not eternal. Hamilton and Wenham both point to the fact that he says the greater light and the lesser light instead of using the more specific term sun and moon. And the reason, according to them and many other scholars, is that the reason he does this is because the names of the sun and moon were also names of pagan deities and other religions. He was trying to avoid confusion. On top of that, the stars are given very little attention, almost as a parenthetical addition or an afterthought, which may be an effort to minimize them in a pagan world that practice astrology. Also, the idea of the luminaries being signs is probably referring to the Jewish customs. Oh, and it seems that verse 14 could suggest a literary reading as well. The reason is because verse 6 refers to the sky, where the birds dwell. But verse 14 says that the sun, the moon, the stars go there. But they don't. And therefore, I would take that as literary reading because they don't go in the sky. They go in the stellar heavens, I guess, as MacArthur would put it. So, yeah. Now, I want to also address evolution a little bit here. The evidence for evolution includes homologous structures, similar structures in various animals, common DNA, vestigial organs, which is organs that used to have use but no longer do, embryology, microevolution, and transitional fossils. All of that can really be debated. Some of them are just plain false, like embryology. It was proven that Ernest Haeckel, the one who did that famous drawing of the embryos, actually faked the drawings. But nonetheless, I'm not really going to address most of the problems here, but I am going to just give the different evidences for both sides. The evidence against evolution includes irreducible complexity, explosions of life, most notably the Cambrian explosion, the fact that evolution typically decays the genome, not expands it, the fact that we are designed beyond what's necessary for survival, because evolution only gives what's necessary for survival, and much more that I'm not going to get into. There's a middle ground, which is theistic evolution. This view says that life does look designed, but God designed it through evolution. Those who hold this would combine arguments from both sides. Now, theistic evolution and creation would be the main parts of an intelligent design argument. So, granted, intelligent design does not necessarily say which God did it. Intelligent design actually incorporates many things, or not many things, those two things. It could be evolution, or it could be creation. It was just a God did it. Now, I hold to intelligent design, so I go further and say it was the God of the Bible who created everything directly. I don't believe theistic evolution or anything like that. Thus, my position is creation, for I do not see the evidence for evolution compelling, but there's not enough time to address it here. I might address it in a different video. The one thing I'll say that until 150 years ago, there was not a single Christian who believed that God guided creation. Not a single one. There has always been agreement that God directly created everything in creation. It wasn't until a guy came up and said, hey, here's a theory where we don't need God. And people were like, God did it. Like, that sounds more like a compromise than anything. That's why I don't really hold to it as being biblically correct. Therefore, it would be hard to say Genesis leaves room for evolution anyway. Here's a short bibliography that I'm going to give you, especially the idea of creation. One, Steve Loftman and Howard Glicksman, Your Design Body, published by Discovery Institute, 2022. Stephen Meyer, Darwin's Doubt, published by HarperCollins Publishers in 2014. And then there's actually a lot of authors. It's called Theistic Evolution, a Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique by Crossway in 2017. Some of the authors are J.P. Moreland, Stephen Meyer, Christopher Shaw, and some others. Now, that book's kind of long, so I would recommend the other two first, but if you have time, it's like that thick. So if you have time, pick up that book too. Let's see. So Genesis 1:26-29, that's where we come in. The creation of mankind is the climax of the first creation, or of the first creation account, the second one being Genesis 2. As Wenham explains, quote, while the creation of light and the firmament on days 1 and 2 are described quite succinctly, those aspects of the environment described in days 3 to 5 that affect man more closely, plants, sun, moon, and animals, take up proportionally more narrative space. And the creation of man himself is the definition, and the definition of his role is the fullest account of all. Why is that? Oh, end quote. That can be found on page 37 of Wenham's commentary. Now, why is this? Because the creation of mankind is, quote, without a doubt the focal point of Genesis 1, the climax of 6 days' work. And that's also on page 37, that quote. End quote, by the way. Now, there's debate on why God uses the plural in verse 26, the traditional Christian view being the Trinity. The traditional Jewish view, since Philo, a first century Jewish philosopher, was that it refers to God and the angels. Victor Hamilton takes the view that it's referring to God and his spirit. That's on page 134 of Victor Hamilton's commentary. Wenham takes the plural us and ours, referring to God and the angels. However, as Wenham notes, there is no place in Scripture that God says that the angels are made in God's image, which to me is a pretty big problem with that idea, with the idea that the first person plural is referring to angels. I'm more apt to take this as an appeal to God and his spirit, with perhaps a hidden meaning to the Trinity. I don't think it's very explicit, but I think it's there. This seems more likely on account of the language used. It says God wants to make mankind in our image and likeness, and this says God created in his image, singular. This is very, very Trinitarian language. And there's also there's no indication that angels were even involved in creation. So why he would, or if they were even created at that point, it's possible, but we don't really know. But nonetheless, this is nearly Trinitarian language where God is plural but singular. Therefore, it's hard not to see this as a reference to at least two people in the Trinity, Holy Spirit and the Father. This being said, and as said before, this could be referring to the Son as well in a hidden way. Now, the Imago Dei, that being the image of God, has been the subject of much debate. The first thing to note is that it is not referring to physicality. It's not referring to material. God is spirit, so it can't be referring to that. Origen, a 3rd century Christian writer, he says, quote, "But is our inner man invisible and corporeal, incorruptible and immortal, that is made according to the image of God. For it is in such qualities that the image of God is more correctly understood." John Cassian agrees that it's not referring to the physical, but to the non-physical. According to Victor Hamilton, it is well known in both Egyptian and Mesopotamian society, the king or some high-ranking official might be called the image of God. Genesis 1 may be using royal language to describe man. That's a quote from page, 135. Wenham agrees that's about royalty, saying that we are regent. See, that's on page 32. Yeah. He goes on to explain that it means that we are his representatives on earth. Wenham does. Gregory of Nyssa agrees with the Imago Dei, meaning, quote, that man's creation in the image of the nature that governs all demonstrates precisely that he has from the beginning a royal nature. Chrysostom says that, quote, "This is why man is the image of God. He has no creature over him, and there's no one over God. He rules over everything." The ESV Study Bible goes through several views, and then concludes that, quote, "All these insights can be put together by observing that the resemblances, man is like God in a series of ways, allowing man to represent God in ruling and establish worldly relationships with God, with one another, and with the rest of creation." Now, the Cultural Background Study Bible explains how other cultures use the term, then concludes, "The biblical view is similar, as people are created in the image of God, embodying his qualities and doing his work. They are symbols of his presence and act on his behalf as his representatives." The word representatives could be, or it really is, a governmental term, thus could be referring to royalty. Now, despite the agreement of so many throughout time, something else is missing. Yes, royalty and ruling are there. In my opinion, something else is missing. So while ruling and royalty are there, there's something else there to me, and I couldn't quite figure it out, and I had to say it was reason. Now, I'm hesitant to say that humans can't, or animals can't reason at all, but we obviously have a superior capacity to do so. The MacArthur Study Bible says, in regards to the Imago Dei, quote, "Man is a living being capable of embodying God's communicable attributes. In his rational life, he is like God in that he can reason and had intellect, will, and emotion. In a moral sense, he was like God because he was good and sinless." I would disagree with him with the part of reason, but not with anything else. The reason is because animals obviously have will and emotions too, so it can't just be that. Or we can't be separated from them with that. And in the beginning, I would say animals were good and sinless, though they're not really held to a moral standard. John of Damascus says intellect and free will. Another thing to note is how revolutionary it was to say that mankind is made in the image of God. In ancient Near Eastern mythology, we were created to to serve the gods and help them eat. However, in truth, we were made by God to rule the world with him and as his representatives. What a contrast. On a similar note, Gregory of Nyssa says, quote, "The command was simple. When light was created, God said, 'Let there be light.' Heaven was also made without deliberation. These, though, were before the creation of humans. For humans there was deliberation. He did not say, as when creating things, 'Let there be a human.' As when creating other things, 'Let there be a human.' See how worthy you are. Your origins are not in an imperative. Instead, God deliberated about the best way to bring about a life creature worthy of honor. We are a very special creature indeed. So don't let anyone put you down." There are multiple differences between mankind and animals. The most well-known is that we were created in the image of God. Secondly, we were not made to simply multiply after our kind, like the animals were. Instead, we are just told to multiply, and we are characterized by sexual difference. Now, that's not to say that animals aren't. It's mentioned later in Genesis 6:9, but we are specifically, very early on, distinguished through our sex. Thirdly, as the MacArthur Study Bible says, the command to rule separated him from the rest of living creation and defined his relationship as above the rest of creation. That's another difference. This is basically repeated by Chrysostom. Another thing to note is that God telling animals to multiply is described as a blessing. Quote, sexuality is not an accident of nature, like evolution would have us say, nor is it simply a biological phenomenon. Instead, it is a gift from God, or of God. That's Hamilton, for, page 138. We also see no indication that sexuality nor sex or gender, which is pretty much the same thing, is meant to diversify into bisexual, transgender, or anything else. I've heard people say that multiply according to their kind. Since animals could do it, we could do it in terms of gender. Well, the most obvious problem with that, minus the fact that it's just not referring to that, would be that we're not told to multiply according to our kind. We're just told that we are male and female and to multiply. So either way, that's irrelevant. Yeah. So I kind of want to get into transgenderism a little bit because it's an important topic. So for most of Christian history and Jewish history, transgenderism has been seen as sinful. While I do not think that being transgender is a sin, engaging in cross-dressing or hormone therapy and the like is sinful. See Deuteronomy 22:5. Recently, however, engaging in transgender behavior is seen as permissible or even celebrated. A lot of this comes from the way they were treated before. For transgender people were mistreated instead of being given help that they need. Nonetheless, the answer is not to celebrate or to accept sin, but to love the sinner and still get them help. So what happened was the pendulum was way over here. And then instead of putting it in the middle, where we don't accept the sinful behavior, but we try to get them help, they put it over here and celebrated the sin. What it needs to be is in the middle. The golden mean, as Aristotle would put it. Ultimately, gender is rooted in biology, and this is proven by the John Jones experiment. It's not really talked about as it should be, but the John Jones experiment, I can't get into it now. I might do a video on it later on. Look it up. John Jones experiment. Yes. Not only so, but also the fact that God created us male and female shows that it is rooted in our essence and nature, not to mention in creation itself. Thus, engaging in transgenderism is sinful, and they need help, not hate. Still love them. Nonetheless, humans having dominion over everything by no means says that we should exploit it or misuse it. Firstly, it is a gift, and so we should treat it with respect. It's a gift from God of all people, so we should definitely treat it with the utmost respect. Secondly, as Wenham explains, quote, ancient Oriental kings were expected to be devoted to the welfare of their subjects, especially the poorest and the weakest of the members of society. See Psalms 72:12-14. By upholding divine principles of law and justice, rulers promoted peace and prosperity for all their subjects. Similarly, mankind is here commissioned to rule nature as a benevolent king, acting as God's representative over them and therefore treating them in the same way as God who created them. That is on Wenham 33. See also study the ESV Study Bible, page 52. For these two reasons, it being a gift and that kings were expected to do this, we should take care of the earth that we were given. Now, Genesis 1:29-30. Notice that everything, animal and human, was vegetarian. It can be debated whether or not they could eat meat, or they just couldn't eat meat at all anyway. That can be debated. However, what is clear is that they didn't eat meat. Now, Wenham and other scholars have suggested that after the fall you could eat meat, and then that's reiterated in Genesis 9. However, that's not really true. There's no evidence for that. Wenham and others point to the fact that God killed an animal to clothe Adam and Eve, and that Abel sacrificed animals. But there's no evidence of them being eaten. They're just killed. And therefore, I don't see that as evidence. Now let's go into some of the wisdom from the early church. The Holy Spirit hovering or moving over the waters was interpreted by different Christians, namely Jerome and Ephraim the Syrian, as to symbolize baptism. Their view is that the Holy Spirit is what makes baptism true baptism, see Jerome, and that baptism by the Spirit makes people children of God. So here we see the early idea of baptismal regeneration, the idea that you need to be baptized to be saved. And that's as early as the Epistle of Barnabas, which may date as early as the 1st century. And it was true it was believed by pretty much every Christian that we know of, all the way up to Zwingli in the 16th century, I think. So that's pretty much all of Christian history it's been believed. But nonetheless, let's go on. The presence and separation of darkness is intriguing. According to Augustine in the 2 books on Genesis against the Manichaeans, quote, it does not say here, God made darkness, because darkness is merely the absence of light. God did not necessarily create darkness, it was just an effect of there not being light, which I thought was interesting. Nonetheless, he did create the universe, which contained darkness, because there was no light, so he kind of created it, but he still also showed his authority over it by separating it and naming it. Now, Gregory of Nyssa and Ambrose both say that the seed is also a representation of the general resurrection, the plant seeds. With Gregory of Nyssa pointing to Paul to connecting the concept. This is a good connection to make, especially because it's biblical, and Paul does it, and it shows that our physical bodies will be raised. However, if our bodies will be raised, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus' body was raised. Clement of Alexandria and Marius Victorinus both say that we were made in the image of Christ. Marius Victorinus specifically calls us the image of the image. That is, the image of Christ, who's the image of God. However, we were created in the image of a plurality, our God, suggesting that Christ and the Father are one image. Origen and Diadochus of Fotis, separated image and likeness. Now, this was probably one of my favorite things I read from the early church about Genesis 1. Oden says, quote, now the fact that he said he made him in the image of God and was silent about likeness points to nothing else but this, that man received the honor of God's image in his first creation, whereas the perfection of God's likeness was reserved for him at the consummation. End quote. Why is this? According to Origen, quote, the purpose of this was that man should acquire it for himself by his own earnest efforts to imitate God, end quote. Diadochus of Fotis says something quite similar. All men are, quote, all men are made in the image of God, but to be in his likeness is granted only to those who through great love have brought their own freedom into subjection to God. For only when we do not belong to ourselves do we become like him who through love has reconciled himself to us. Now, they're not the only ones. Gregory of Nyssa also says this, quote, let us make man in our image after our likeness. We possess one by creation. We acquire the other by free will. In the first structure, it is given to us to be born in the image of God. By free will, there is formed in us the being in the likeness of God. Sedona says something similar, quote, these are the virtues that man acquires by considering and controlling his own senses. He takes off the old man who was corrupted in the convolution of his errors and wears a new one who is renewed in the knowing of the image of his creator and becomes as a whole an effigy, likeness and image of God. But she kind of connects image of God and likeness in salvation, while the other one is separated, the two said likeness comes later. And I would agree with that. Let's go into notes from Matthew Henry. He has some good pointers. Matthew Henry has a typology between darkness of the earth before God and after God intervenes. Regarding the state of the world in verse 2, he explains, quote, observe that there was nothing desirable to be seen, for the world was without form and void. It was confusion and emptiness. In like manner, the work of grace in the soul is a new creation, and in a graceless soul, one that is not born again, there is disorder, confusion, and every evil work. It is empty of all good, for it is without God, it is dark, it is darkness itself. This is our condition by nature till Almighty grace works a change in us. Now, I would disagree that we're empty of, or we are nothing but evil. We're empty of all good. I would disagree with that. But I think this picture is beneficial. Before Christ, we are blinded and thus lost and confused. Similarly, there is evil work upon evil work, and a lot of people live in the sin of debauchery, just drinking and drugs and all these other, and sex and all these other things that don't necessarily constitute a godly living. This is our innate nature before God's grace. Though we are not empty of all good, we are made in the image of God and thus have some goodness in us, even if that good is corrupted. I similarly like the emphasis on God's power or God's word, the power of God's word as emphasized by Matthew Henry. Notice that God doesn't have to put any effort into creation, and of some things at least. In other things, he seems to put effort, like he says he made them. But light, dry land, and vegetation, he simply spoke and it just appeared. Nonetheless, considering that there was literally nothing, and God spoke, and there was light, which some suggest is the Big Bang, light being the Big Bang, it is pretty impressive achievement. Furthermore, Matthew Henry connects this to how, quote, the Blessed Spirit works upon the will and affections by enlightening the understanding. He connects, as many Christians have, the idea of light and understanding. He goes on to say that darkness would have been always fallen upon man if the Son of God had not come in and given us understanding. 1 John 5:20. Matthew Henry's insight on the separation of light and darkness is of benefit as well. He says that God, quote, God divided the light from the darkness, for what fellowship does light have with darkness? This not only goes with the idea that hell is darkness, as the Bible explains, it's fire, but it's also dark, and that heaven is light, but also goes with what Paul said, though using different imagery. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. That's 1 Corinthians 5:8 ESV version. We should get rid of all dark deeds and stick with the deeds of light, the deeds of God. Similarly, Oden says that we should put off the water, which represents sin, so that land may appear, our bodies, and be called earth, which can produce fruit for God. Similarly, Matthew Henry has a very sanctifying view of God's creation of day and night. He says the day and the night are the Lord's. So let us use both to his honor by working for him every day and resting in him every night, meditating on his law both day and night. This, I think, complements what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Paul says, do everything to the glory of God. Matthew Henry says, use all time you have to the glory of God. Since everything is made by God, everything should be used for him. As Matthew Henry puts it, though the use of them is allowed to man, they are from God, and to his service and honor they must be used. This is very true. Not only is it from him, but they were made for him, namely Jesus Christ. Colossians 1:16. As for the luminaries, Matthew Henry makes an interesting note. He says the scriptures were written not to gratify curiosity or to make us astronomers, but to lead us to God and make us saints. This is why the Bible never answers all of our questions scientifically, or in really pretty much any area. In other words, the Bible tells us what we need to know, not everything we want to know. Matthew Henry also explains that the luminaries in the sky shine forth like God intended, but our lights don't always do that. This should not be so, but rather we should take the hint from nature and obey God. Now, I also want to point out something that Wenham says in his commentary, page 38, which explains how God is seen as lawgiver in the fact that, quote, he divides the light from the darkness and the land from the sea, and he names them. He appoints the stars for signs and fixed seasons. The animate creation is told to be fruitful and multiply. Man is to subdue the earth. With this goes the corollary that all creatures will fulfill their divinely appointed role only if they adhere to God's directive. So we have to obey God if we want to fulfill our purpose. We can't make our own purpose. That's not how it works. A vacuum can't make its own purpose. AI can't make its own purpose because the only thing that gives something purpose is its creation, or its creator, sorry. Now, as of mankind, Matthew Henry points out that we are the last and unique to all other creatures, and that we should not indulge ourselves like the beasts of the earth. We should not gratify all of our desires like the creatures of the earth. We should be godly because we are made to be godly. He also says that originally his, i.e. the man's, understanding saw divine things clearly and truly. There were no errors or mistakes in his knowledge. His will consented at once in all things to the approval of God. Furthermore, quote, his affections were all regular, and he had no appetites or passions, being like evil things. His thoughts were easily brought and fixed to the best subjects. Thus holy, thus happy were our first parents in having the image of God upon them. Now let's go a little bit into God's character. Now first we see Trinity, as I kind of discussed earlier. Now for Spirit of God, many scholars prefer Wind of God. And in fact, Gordon Wenham translates it that way. However, Hamilton points out that when translation is obviously wind, it has a destructive force, like in Exodus 15:10. You can see that on page 114 of Victor Hamilton's commentary. Since Genesis as a whole is about creation, let's quote him real quick. on the other hand, when it's obviously meaning either breath or spirit, like Genesis 6:3, Job 27:3, etc., quote, the emphasis is one of energizing, giving life and vitality, creating and not uncreating. That's also on page 114. Since Genesis as a whole, or Genesis 1 as a whole is about creation, it'd be wise to take this as spirit, whether capital S or lowercase s, not wind. This being said, is it spirit with a capital S or spirit with a lowercase s? I would say it's more of a capital S, while probably most would say lowercase is more neutral and therefore should be taken. However, if God has a spirit, wouldn't that spirit be divine too? Like we have a human spirit, wouldn't that be a God spirit? You know, that just kind of makes sense. But nonetheless, we get Trinity here. Now, the most obviously characteristic of God would be his role as creator. This is the root of Jewish and Christian monotheism. For only the Creator deserves to be worshipped, and he is the creator of all things and their ability to change, and it still makes us even in the womb. Therefore, we should obey him. Well, we'll get into that in the application part, but nonetheless, omnipotent is another thing, all-powerful. Connected to the aspect of God being creator is his power. In Genesis 1, we clearly see that God created everything. From the end of the universe from nothing, which is also said in other places in the Old and New Testament. In fact, from Genesis 1 and other places like Hebrews 11:3, it says that God created the universe and certain things in the universe by simply speaking. This is a very powerful God we serve, which is amazing. I wouldn't want it any other way. Furthermore, the term used in Hebrew for God, Elohim, in this chapter, denotes strength. So we also get power from that too. Now, we also get sovereignty and authority. It's very interesting how when God speaks, things happen. We can see what the apostles said on a bigger scale when they said, quote, even nature and its host obey him. This not only shows his power, but his sovereignty in everything obeys him, even inanimate objects. God also names everything, though delegated the authority to name animals to Adam, which in ancient times demonstrated authority. Furthermore, him giving authority to mankind is only possible if God himself is authoritative to us. God is also creative and intelligent. While not directly told in Genesis 1, from what we know about the universe, whether it be anatomy, biology, astronomy, physics, whatever, we find that the universe and its coasts are very complex and beautiful. And yet God was able to make all of it because he's so creative and intelligent. He's also a blesser and he's love. See, God is seen blessing animals and humans with the gift of being able to multiply. This shows that God loved and loves his creation and wants it to flourish. This also shows his love because nobody blesses the things that they hate. That wouldn't really make sense. They bless things that they love. He is apparently especially fond of humanity, who he blessed with the ability to multiply, authority, and the honor of being in his image. Lastly, provider. At the end of Genesis 1, God says that all animals and people are allowed to eat the plants. God provided food for them, and he'll provide for us if we seek his kingdom first, Matthew 6. Now let's go into application. Worship and obey God is the first and foremost. He is the sole creator of life, including you and me. He is sovereign and he loves you and wants the best for you. Therefore, we should trust him. Also, trust God is the next one. For he is the ultimate provider and is omnipotent and can do anything you need him to. Maybe not everything he wants you to do, but everything he needs that you need from him, he will give it to you. Now, I had a few questions. Just to get things started, I want you to put your thoughts below so we can talk. I want to hear what you have to say, and I might push a little bit, see why you say what you say, but give me your opinion. And if you can't think of anything, I have some questions here. Genesis 1 is full of literary devices, as we've covered, as explained by Hamilton and Wenham, and like I said, me. So how much of it is literal and how much of it is literary? Genesis 1 seems to be polemic against other pagan beliefs. Does this compromise its reliability? If you're writing against something, does that automatically make you unreliable? I would say no. But let's hear what you think. What other there weren't many characteristics. Oh, there's actually quite a few, but I would like to see if there's any other characteristics of God that are in this chapter. And lastly, how can we apply this? Because there weren't many applications. That was what I was thinking earlier, or a few seconds ago, that there's not many applications. So if you can think of any more, let me know. So thank you for joining me on this adventure, and let's keep seeking so that we can keep finding, and let's do it together.